Jamie, thanks for coming here as well. We had a conversation like this in Austin as well, and I thought it'd just be really great for our audience to understand this side of OpenSSF, which is not just about connecting the developer community and the maintainers community and helping benefit broadly the people on the front lines of building open source code, but also helping align the business community as well with what we're trying to do and the importance of this and the like. And so I've really appreciated having you on our board and the leadership you've shown in helping wrestle a very large board we have at this point with a lot of divergent ideas. But I thought it'd be helpful just for folks to understand your journey and kind of how you think about this stuff and get to know you better. And so, yeah, thought we could dive into that, if that sounds good.
Okay, sounds good. And first of all, thanks to all of you who stayed here through a long day and the energy that we still got with all the presenters at the end of the day. Really impressive, and all of you out there in the ether. This is such an important topic, and so I really appreciate your time. I started my career as a software developer, and so I had upfront experience over the years producing software and then being part of larger offering teams inside the IBM company. When I started really working on software in IBM, we really didn't have a software business, so I saw the business go from virtually 0 to 20 billion over a period of time. So it's quite a large business. And of course, we acquired many firms, including Red Hat. And then I eventually moved over to the systems business to own software and ended up owning the hardware. And through a lot of this journey, first of all, you can't really do anything with hardware without software last time I checked. So they're intricately linked from a value proposition. And the journey gives me a lot of perspective on things that are really quite important now and complex, which is primarily product security. And so over the years, I had a lot of opportunity to work on product security domains in terms of how we do things as developers. I'd say the landscape has changed a lot over the last decades, if you will. I mean, there's always been security challenges, but now there are a different complexion of security challenges that we have to deal with. Some of the things that we had, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, which was ineffective software pipelines, ineffective CI/CDs, whatever we want to call them, only get manifested in a much important rate and pace, if you will, when you start talking about the topics we've discussed here today, which is open source and the complexity that is now brought to the table. So I think this is a very fascinating topic. It will keep all of us gainfully employed for as long as we want to work. And I'm happy to bring my perspective to the governing board of OpenSSF.
Well, we've heard a fair bit about how things are technically different these days, the rise of certain kinds of supply chain attacks and that sort of thing. But what do you think is different over the last 5 years in terms of how the business community as a whole looks at cybersecurity, how they think about supply chain attacks, but things that you think we as OpenSSF should be tracking or are tracking now thanks to kind of this insight?
Well, I think for many of us that have worked in software a large part of our lives, we knew inherently that there were security risk with some of the things that we perhaps saw. The inefficient delivery pipelines, the awareness that not all open source was maintained equally as well, the fact that not all open source, for instance, was curated, the fact that security has always been a challenging discipline to get developers to pay attention to. Many cases, productivity has won out over security. The fact that many organizations are running such aged software, and it was all about return on the investment, not necessarily about the age and the implications of that age. And when you look at embedded systems, when you look at things like manufacturing systems and systems that are in power and utilities, it even becomes a much stronger aging, if you will, and challenge that you have to deal with. In fact, I have some manufacturing systems that I just have to firewall off in like triple layers of firewalls because they're running Windows 7. And it's a hardened device where you have to, replace something that maybe costs millions of dollars to eliminate the Windows 7, form factor out of there. So I think that in the last few years, all of this has really come to a head in that, unfortunately, the bad guys are utilizing a lot of this as an opportunity to extract funding and money. There is a lot of ransomware, of course, and a lot of attacks that do come in from nation-state organized actors. For all of us that run cyber operations, you're able to sit there every day and see exactly where they're coming from, which country the attacks are coming from. And so you sit there and say, okay, these are coming from X, these are coming from Y, these are coming from Z. The rate and pace of these more sophisticated attacks in the last few years, of course, stimulated the need for OpenSSF and all the dialogue with the U.S. government and other governments, because we had a series from SolarWinds to Kaseya to Log4j, and I would argue that for all of us that deal with cyber, we had to treat the Russian invasion as another cyber attack. So it really changed the landscape. So you see this tsunami of regulation. I get copied on regulation every week from our government relations team, and it is just enormous. It is hundreds and hundreds of pages of proposed regulation and or documents coming out from CISA, from the U.S. government, from other governments around the world. And I can't even imagine small organizations being able to consume this. We at IBM are struggling to consume this amount of documentation, to comment on it, and that kind of thing. So the other thing that's in a lot of this documentation is that boards are going to be held accountable. You better have your cyber act together if you're on a board of directors. There is proposed legislation that boards will have to manifest certain skills and things like that. Now, all this legislation actually has to go through the mill, if you will. It has to be go through the appropriate process, but just the level of commentation on this, of course, is causing a lot of senior executive and boards to be concerned. We at IBM, we meet regularly with our board, with our audit committee, I think for this reason, since all of this started to get more active. And you're going to see that behavior because as soon as boards get involved, then you get lots more of your executive team naturally involved. Now, my cyber team would say, well, this is great because we finally get a lot more attention. So we've got the attention of everyone around security. The important thing, though, is we need to act upon that attention. Like, what are we going to do about it, right? And that's why this meeting is so important.
You might want to be careful what you wish for, in other words. And I'm thinking a little bit about the DOJ's kind of pursuit of Joe Sullivan, who was the Uber CISO at a time when they suffered a major data breach. They tried to close it quietly, but ended up making a series of kind of questionable decisions. And now, even though he'd moved on, he's now at Cloudflare, at least taking a break from that, is being held somewhat personally accountable for some of these actions that are being taken. Well, we'll see where that thing goes, but it's sending a chill, I think, out there to some degree amongst the cybersecurity community.
Oh, it is the Twitter situation as well with the
with Mudge.
that situation. I mean, it's very serious. So anyone that's in a point of power, if you will, from a cyber perspective or product security perspective, has got a lot of responsibility and obligation to make sure that they're being transparent with the executive team and with board of directors and audit committees, et cetera.
Well, and we also saw the Log4Shell vulnerability itself was discovered by a researcher for Alibaba, who, well, let's just say the company got into a substantial amount of trouble from the Chinese government for not having reported it first confidentially to the Chinese government instead of doing the right thing, which they did, which is they reported it upstream to the Apache Software Foundation and started the process of getting it remediated. Made some mistakes, but we don't have to go into that. So in general, governments obviously appear to be paying a lot more attention, for better and for worse, in this space. And I have to say, so I worked in the White House in the Office of Science and Tech Policy in 2009, at the beginning of the Obama administration, when we had this small little window of time to make the case for open data, open source software, open kind of everything, but we were quickly overwhelmed by all of the stuff that happens to the new administration, cleaning up after the last one. We don't have to talk politics, but anyways, but 2009 me saw very clearly that no one in the executive branch had ever written a line of Python or other code, and we were coming off of 30 years kind of government being told, like, no, technology is built by the private sector, you guys are just the buyer, and the subtext was the less informed buyer you can be, the better. And instead, today it's a lot different. Instead, this meeting at the National Security Council and the guidance that we've seen come out of CISA and other places shows not only them asking a lot of the right questions, but also having a lot of more domain expertise and asking really and listening to us and kind of incorporating that in, which is kind of new for us at the Linux Foundation. I think most projects haven't really engaged with government, and those of us in the open source space kind of writ large have not really seen engagement with the government as a first order priority. So it seems like, though, that this is something that our board wants us to do and wants to see us playing a role, not just in helping build better software and specs and guides and things, but engaging with governments of the world edge.
Yeah, I think so, and it has placed a more challenge on OpenSSF because when we formulated, and I first met Brian in November of last year, we were formulating a new governing board, and then shortly after that, what happens? Our Christmas holiday, at least in parts of the world, was destroyed by Log4j, and we all got to be on a daily call or many, many daily calls for every day for weeks to come. So I think the government, in the United States, they called a meeting shortly after that of about 20 firms, including the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation, and that's how we started on this journey. And they quickly developed a point of view that one way to work with the industry and the communities was to work through OpenSSF. Because so many of the firms they invited to the White House were already on the OpenSSF governing board, it became a practical approach for how do we work together and solve this problem. And so that's, I think, how OpenSSF got into such a limelight position. And then, of course, we had the May meeting where we continued that. And as Brian said, they were very engaged. I mean, CISA was there. The National Security Council was there. They stayed there with us all day to really understand what we could achieve. Of course, you can realize that at that time we'd already had the Russian invasion, and what the fear was that the vulnerabilities would be weaponized, of course, right, for the purposes of that. Turns out, from what many of us could see, it was mainly the Ukraine attacking the Russians and vice versa. Not to say that other things didn't happen, but that was viewed as a national security thing that we had to think about, right? Yeah. Think about, because that's that's a possibility that these vulnerabilities absolutely can be used for that kind of purpose.
Now government as top cop, right? Is one paradigm. And we saw that with like the FTC fine of Equifax, et cetera. Government as regulator, as like saying, here's now requirements if you want to sell to us or do business or whatever, is a thing. And that's what we saw with like the SBOM part of, Executive Order 14028, and some of the other hints like here's going to be standards for how they procure software. But we haven't yet seen, and we've seen hints of it, and there's even some language in a bill in the NDAA, I think, that might pass, about government as investor, right? Government, I mean, they invest in basic R&D all over the place. They invest, I mean, you see like NASA, et cetera, and you see them investing in building some technical competency. But do you think government can be, and we see some governments creating open source software too, but do you think governments can play a kind of a role commensurate to their consumption of open source code in investing back in and providing the kind of resources we need to help harden the open source landscape? Yeah,
I think there's two perspectives. As the executive order strengthens the expectation of government agencies, they're naturally, I think, will be more informed and become more activist and wanting to have a seat at the table. We also do see evidence that they fund a lot of innovation. You can certainly see that in the CHIPS Act that was recently passed, which is all about getting more semiconductor capacity, in particular, into North America, into the United States. It's a great example, and Intel is nodding over here, of course. That's an example where there's prominent active investing in something that's really going to make a difference. And I think security is right in line with that. Now, a lot of the investment tends to be the trickle-down effect. I've seen that a lot with quantum computing, where there's these national quantum science centers at national labs, and there's the National Science Foundation that gets funding, and it trickles down, right? So I think there's got to be a benefit. They've got to look at the benefits of trickle down versus, the direct attack, if you will, to get some of these things done faster. Trickle down does work. It funds a lot of research. It funds a lot of interested parties. But it's not like we all got together and committed against, one goal and one moonshot. And so when you look at your 10-pronged list, it's an exemplar, if you will, of a way that we can tackle this. The 10 items may change over time, but it's a good start, right, to try to make a difference in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation, I'm hopeful that governments outside of the United States will be paying attention to this. And I know there's some activity here in the European Union on that front, and hopefully we'll see some more soon. The other big topic I just thought it'd be worth kind of talking about is education. I know how personal it is for you, how important that is for IBM. Do we have a shot at really getting better best practices knowledge, better secure development software knowledge out there to the mass of software developers? And what do you think we need to do if we really want to have a huge impact in that space?
Well, we've done a few things, as you know, together, which is IBM has a goal to educate 150,000 students in the next few years with security education, and so we teamed to get the Linux Foundation OpenSSF education out through the channel as well. We are focusing on not just traditional universities, but also historically black college and universities to reach a different constituency. Because even with just basic STEM today, particularly in the United States, which I'm much more familiar with than I am a lot of the other countries, we don't have enough reach. We're not reaching enough individuals in core STEM, much less security. And when you talk to a lot of the universities, and I'm on the board for a number of these universities, I work with NC State on quantum and Clemson and University of Tennessee, a lot of land grant organizations that are near where I live. There's not enough faculty to teach security topics because they can't afford the salary. If you're a security expert, you're probably going to be working somewhere for a reasonably high salary, and that's not what academia is paying. And so it becomes a real challenge, and not that they don't have the demand, but they don't have the faculty. So I think they've got to come to grips with that. It's probably not going to be about hiring PhD level professors for all of these teaching tasks. How do you marry that with your accreditation goals, your curriculum goals? A lot of accreditations tied to the seniority of the faculty. And they probably do need to find a way to embrace more online education from experts. You guys are experts. The people speaking today are experts. And providing their point of view and education out to the students can make a difference. I think it will make a difference. And we've got to break through some of those, what I call academic rating rules and everything that seem to get in the way. I mean, I've had this discussion on quantum engineering and other topics where just changing the basic curriculum at an organization is very challenging because it gets in the way of a lot of established norms, if you will.
Yeah. Well, how about reaching developers who are past the point of like either their education phase or like the first part of their career, right? Whether they're taking that formally or like myself or a lot of people I know kind of taught themselves informally about software development. What are some things you think we could do to reach people who are in the workforce who might dismiss the idea of needing to take what they might consider a remedial course or other things? What are some things that we could be doing at OpenSSF to reach them?
Well, I think one of the paths that we can reach broader audiences are through schools that really teach continuing education, whether that's through community colleges or other forms of teaching opportunities where they really encourage ongoing certification for different career paths as well as badges and that kind of thing. So non-traditional approaches, I think. I see that a lot in, where I'm at. North Carolina is the state I live in, and it's a very fast growing state, a lot of technology, life sciences. And you see a lot of that from the business community, interest in ongoing education.
Well, we kind of told the business world, okay, so first off, when IBM dove into open source in 1999 and said, we're going to go all in on Linux and and Apache and a few other things. IBM also said we're going to put $1 billion into investment into Linux, and it wasn't clear what the time frame was, but I'm sure over the last 20 years you've spent well more than $1 billion on upstream contributions to Linux and to everything else. But most companies who consume open source software probably have no formal upstream contribution policy or prioritize the importance of that. Many of them are starting to develop OSPOs and the like. But what I'm curious about is how do we get some sort of way for the companies out there who are consuming the software to think about the cybersecurity issues when they're consuming it. That's why having the concise guides is going to be really important. But when they start to have their developers engaging, reporting bugs, adding features, maybe even writing code and shipping it out, how do we get them to also start to adopt some of these same principles and standards that we're coming up with without it feeling like yet another burden? That's something I struggle with, and I think I'd love to try to figure out on the business side of the house an answer to that as much as on the technology side of the house.
Yeah, I think part of it is just awareness and education, and the reality of all of this is there is no free lunch. I mean, it all appeared free, but it's not really free, right? And if you're a downstream consuming organization, you've either got to pay for the software to be curated, or you got to have the expertise in-house to take the right actions. And I can tell you, I do believe there was a lot of learning from Log4j. I personally was spending half of my day on the phone with financial organizations, literally in group therapy sessions over what does Log4j mean. I'm serious about it. I was pretty exhausted after a few weeks of this because, it's right before the holiday season and people are locking down. They have a strong desire to lock everything down and change nothing. Then all of a sudden, here comes this defect, and there was various views of rolling out this update before the holiday, right? So it was very stressful. And so the learning though that came from it, I think, is why we have a lot of those commercial organizations in OpenSSF today and the governing board, is because they are committed to trying to understand what do they need to do differently. I mean, one of the learnings is don't run on software that's 10 years out of date. I mean, I could see it, right? You can't patch that software. It's just too aged. And it's not to say that if you're a bank, you should be updating every day. That's not practical either. There's no one that's got that kind of rollout strategy. But, I think it's just this awareness that you've got to have the right partnership and acquisition strategy that says, yeah, open source is very productive, but who's standing behind it, right? Who's standing behind it, and how do I ensure that I'm getting what I expect given the organization that I am? And not every organization is the same. Not every organization is a bank. I have obviously a lot of experience with banks, but healthcare, retail, government, and I can see from just the large services arm that IBM has, I can tell you there's repeat offenders on ransomware attacks. What I mean is firms that get a ransomware attack and are back again another 6 months with a ransomware attack.
Because of the same compromise?
And probably different, we don't always know, but I would tell you that that's all going to come to an end too, because some of the insurance policies are being changed now. Lloyd's of London announced they're not going to insure you for ransomware from nation-state attacks. So a lot of them come from some of that, right? So anyway, I think that, there's a landscape change. In other words, if your insurer is going to pay for your ransomware attack, maybe you're not motivated to go out and fix what you need to fix. Maybe it's cheaper just to keep paying your insurance and you get it paid for, right? But not with the huge bills that some of the insurers are now paying out. Yeah. So that's going to come to a stop because the insurers will not be able to afford to do it.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of, I think, financial motivations that we could use to try to steer industry in the right direction. Insurance companies being kind of a dark matter to making this happen. I think we're out of time. I think the other observation I would throw out would be if security researchers could actually start their winter vacations like mid-November.
Yeah, don't do anything over the holiday this year.
If you can find your bugs by November.
Take a break.
Yeah, find your bugs by November 10th. that way we can have a holiday. Yes, that's a best practice. I think we'll try to encode out there. Jamie, thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you. Thanks, everybody out
Thanks
there.
everyone as well. And I'll toss back to Probe.
Can I ask you a quick question?
You may.
Do you have advice on how to navigate conversations with business leaders and how to reach executives to create a shared context, be it that the audit committee, a business line leader, and if so, is there a playbook as you would have for government relationships, but to drive change within your own organization for smaller organizations?
Well, I mean, it depends on the size of your organization, but most organizations should have some sort of security council formed at this point. We meet with ours. We meet with a small group every month and a larger group every quarter, and then we have been at the board a lot. So, but just creating that construct, if you don't have it, is important, because typically you're not going to write a 7-page email about this kind of thing, right? That's not a good practice either. So you need a forum, and it sounds simple, where you have an opportunity to educate, and it needs to be at different levels and appropriately vetted by your legal. We have cyber legal that helps us, right? But that is really, really important, that you have that opportunity. And back to his point about, of course, my CISO sends me all of these mails about Uber and Twitter and everything. If you're the CISO, I think you find this pretty alarming, right? We as leaders have to give those people the ultimate seat at the table. I remember we made a decision on something this past year, a piece of software, and I won't go into the details, that we didn't want to use anymore. And some of the users really were calling me and going, bananas basically. And and I told the CISO, it doesn't matter. Your ruling is your ruling. If once you've made your ruling, they want to take risk for whatever reason, and we allow them to do that, then that's their decision, but the ruling's not going to change. There was a lot, it can't be true, and I'm like, well, it is true, and I can't change it, right? Because one of the things we have looked at is the origin and DNA of a lot more software since SolarWinds. And if it's not the right DNA, it gets off the procurement list, and it's gone. Right? Now, there can be a remediation path, but it has to be remediated. But giving the people a seat at the table, so you never get into this situation of, I was not listened to, and, I had this point of view and people ignored me, which is a lot of what you see in some of these situations. You got to have a very, the process is very important.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.